Piano mover was a part of my job description, but apparently so. That's good. Thank you to Shadows and Dreams, and do go into to Surrey, Deep Dark Surrey, and see their production there. That's May 7th through 11th at the Newton Cultural Centre. Next up, we have something that we're very happy to have happen here in New Westminster. It did actually happen once before, 2009, in this very theatre. The history, the 150-year history of New Westminster was depicted in Song Cycle, as written by George Ryan, who is seated at the piano tonight. And they've agreed to do a reprise of a few of the tunes, a couple of the tunes, to let us hear some of that. One of the reasons, of course, is that recently they went and did one of these Kickstarter fundraising options on the internet, and managed to raise enough money to actually produce the CD and put it out in volume, and that's a fantastic opportunity for New Westminster. So at this point, New West is pleased to invite them, City Stage New West, which is a non-profit society, and they've graced the very stage, as I say, but tonight we'll hear selections from the production called Stump City, was what it was called then. It is still called that, Stump City Stories Musical. So, George, please.
They called it Stump City, 'cause all around all you saw were giant tree stumps stuck in the ground. Stump City was a nickname given to the newly established settlement of New Westminster shortly after its founding. It was not meant as a compliment. It was also, the city was also said to be just a pimple on creation's face that sits beside a stream of liquid mud. This abuse came from merchants from Victoria, resentful of any potential threat to their position as the major settlement on the west coast of British North America. Not to mention their investments in worthless land near present-day Langley, in anticipation that the site for the settlement to be chosen by Colonel Moody would be located there. Unfortunately for their investments, it was in New Westminster instead. In 2009, the City of New Westminster celebrated the 150th anniversary of its founding. To celebrate this event, the fledgling theatre group City Stage New West commissioned me to write a musical theatre piece. As funds were limited, that meant that I would have to write not only the book, but the lyrics and the music for this work. I readily agreed. The resulting musical theatre piece was called Stump City Stories, and the play turned out, when it was finished, to be a chronological series of vignettes. Some were based on important historical events, such as the Great Fire of 1898, or 1911's famous bank robbery at the Bank of Montreal on Columbia Avenue at 6th Street, which was at the time the largest bank robbery ever in North America. My information for this came from no less a source than the New York Times. Or the devastating loss of the capital status to Victoria in 1868, when some of those merchants got their own back. Other vignettes in the play were of a more personal nature. It was a love letter from an early sapper from his fiancée in England. There's a scene with the home life of early settlers. Another of the gossipy meetings for afternoon tea for the ladies who lived in Queen's Park in the 1920s. And poignant remembrances of a Chinese immigrant father after his death by his son. In addition, letters from soldiers home during the Great War were the foundation of the scene. The extension of the city to the area known as the Brow of the Hill, and riding the beloved interurban trams. All these inspired scenes and songs for the show. What I'd like to do tonight is to outline to you how words written in an early settler's diary became one of the major musical numbers in the show. The song, or the musical number, was On the Frozen Fraser. In 1862, a very significant event in the history of the new city occurred. The Fraser River froze over for 4 months. The new rector of Holy Trinity Church, now Holy Trinity Cathedral, Reverend John Sheepshanks, observed and partook in the life of the town during this great freeze. Quotations from his diary, published in the book A Bishop in the Rough, provided the starting point for this song. I'd like to read to you some of what he wrote in his diary. In January 1862, winter set in with a severity unusual even in British Columbia. The Fraser became gradually filled with large floes of ice. These, carried up and down by the ebb and flow of the tide, floated backwards and forwards many days. A wonderful sight it is to see the huge fields of ice being hurried along by the rapid current, grating against the fringe of strong ice which clings to the shore until they have cut it, and it has cut them as straight and even as a glazier cuts an irregular sheet of glass with his diamond. All this is striking, and the sound perhaps more so. It is grand and solemn to hear morning, noon, and night that continual crashing going on. It then being apparent that we were in for a spell of wintry weather, various preparations were made, notably by the Canadian portion of the population, for winter amusements. Sleighs were rapidly made, and presently the ladies were being driven about in the rough equipage, made smart with skins and jingling with bells. Hockey sticks were cut from the forest, and the male portion of the population, officials, parsons, storekeepers, woodmen, and Indians, were engaged in this exciting game upon the broad river. This has continued now for some weeks. Occasionally carts come down the river upon the ice, and cattle are driven across to the other side. Business is at a standstill, and sleigh driving and hockey have become the order of the day. Communications with the outer world ceased. Accustomed though they were to rough it, the winter of 1862 brought with it more demands on the patience and endurance of the settlers of New Westminster. Sheepshanks writes about his daily routine. When I awake in the morning, the bucket of water for my bath is frozen solid. First thing to be done is to light a fire, taking care not to touch a piece of iron or steel. Put a lump of ice into a saucepan and so get some water, and then pour that when hot upon the ice so that we can wash. I cannot easily comb my hair, for it is frozen together. All the bathed clothes near my mouth are stiff with ice. When one proceeds to breakfast, the cups and saucers are stuck hard to the cupboard. The bread is frozen and must be put in the oven before it is eaten. The ink is solid and the camphor will not burn, but notwithstanding, I like the weather. Here in the heavy frost, there is no wind. Indeed, if there were, we could not live. So this was the material that formed the basis of the musical number on the Frozen Fraser. I'd just like to take a moment to explain what I did with that. The song is itself in 3 sections. The first section is setting the scene with the challenge of the cold. You're going to hear the whole song in a few moments. But you'll hear lines like this. Winter's icy blast freezes my very soul. How long can it take till the frost starts to take its toll? And to go with that, I decided to use a minor key, very obscure minor key of A flat minor, and an insistent rhythm. To give that effect. In the dialogue leading up to the song, Sheepshanks wonders if dying of cold was to be his destiny. And so, as a little joke, I put into the accompaniment the first part of the Force of Destiny Overture by Verdi. Listen for this. You hear that anywhere in the song, it's the theme of fate of destiny. Also in the first section, becomes a little bit more hopeful, how to deal with the weather. You'll hear lines like, we'll make our own paradise, watch as we ride and glide, silently over the ice, and winter will be defied. The second section is the defying and then the enjoying of the winter. First of all, there are sleigh rides. You may hear homemade sleighs skim the ice, hear their bells are jingling. Hands stay warm, feet keep dry, and our faces are tingling. To musicalize this idea, I used a Viennese waltz. 1862, Johann Strauss was at his height, and the Viennese waltzes were all the rage. Listen for that rhythm, and that's what that is portraying. In the middle of the waltz section, the music changes to idea of wonderment at some of the things that are happening during this great freeze. Great surprise in store when from the Brownsville shore, cattle's driven o'er the frozen highway. Then we return to the waltz theme for a verse about the playing of hockey. We will shoot, 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 no one gives a hoot. Though our bodies soar, we can score, score, score. As we glide, 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 and we slide, slide, slide on the mighty Fraser, frozen from side to side. The waltz music builds to a climax and then returns to its first musical idea, but more personal for the Reverend Sheep Saints. Mornings when I wake, a bath I would like to take, but first I have to break all the ice that is formed in my bucket, and so on. And at the very end, it's a very short coda for summing it up, the words of which come from a piece of music that introduced the whole scene. Yes, it was bloody cold.